Hello, my name is Leila Bham, and it's my pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, who will be addressing climate. Climate has gained renewed focus the world over, and investing in climate can be the key to attaining the changes we need. But what actually drives that investment? Our speaker today will be discussing how law, a tool all of us have at hand, can be that driving force. For 20 years, he led Baker McKenzie's global climate law and finance practice, and then founded Pollination, a global climate advisory and investment firm. He has advised governments, companies, multilateral development banks, financial institutions, and NGOs on climate change law and policy and international carbon transactions. A leader in his field, he has been named the Financial Times Asia Pacific Legal Innovator of the Year and has been awarded a member of the Order of Australia. Joining us all the way from Sydney, please welcome Martine Wilder.
So thanks, Leila, very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to be able to address everybody at this Law and Investment Conference. Sorry that I could not be in New York, but hopefully once the COVID period passes, we'll be able to travel again. I think just by way of an introduction, as Leila sort of set out at the beginning, I've been a lawyer was a lawyer for 20 years at Baker McKenzie. And during that period, in watching a lot of the developments around climate change and climate law and policy, it became fairly evident to us that while law plays a critical role, ultimately it needs to team up with finance, and it needs to team up with technology in order to solve the climate problem. So having done 20 years purely, I guess, as a legal advisor, but during that period also worked a lot on law and policy, decided that we would set up a firm that brought together a range of different skill sets in a much more sort of, I guess, ecosystem sort of manner, with lawyers and investment professionals and engineers and scientists to really address climate change from a more systemic way. But as I'm going to talk about today, as a lawyer who's had that background, law remains an absolutely critical part of the puzzle. And I think that quite often that is something that's quite forgotten, and the role of law and policy in accelerating change is also quite forgotten. So it is a great pleasure to often, I guess, having now stepped out of full-time law into a sort of more investment firm, to come back to those roots and see why that's so critical. So I'd just like to begin today a little bit more with setting the context. And as many of you know, since 2015, with the signing of the Paris Agreement, there's been a sort of a global commitment towards reducing emissions and to bringing emissions down to what are safe levels in line with the Paris Agreement. What this has driven over the last few years is an increasing dialogue around the need to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Although, if you talk to most scientists today, it's pretty clear that the next 10 years are absolutely critical, and we really should be targeting getting to net zero by 2030 and not 2050. In addition to that, while the Paris Agreement was reached in 2015, one of the challenges, I think, is that post-Paris, things move fairly slowly. Countries had agreed to sort of move ahead with their nationally determined contributions, how they would contribute to climate change, but even a lot of those are still relatively unambitious. And so the weight of global commitment towards driving significant reductions in emissions, is still one that needs far more momentum. However, what we've seen in the last year or so is a significant increase in activity around commitment to reducing global emissions. And I just want to talk a little bit by why that's the case. So the first reason is that the significant push on the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, which Mark Carney sort of drove, has really seen the investment community and the finance community very much address and look at why we should be asking companies to disclose what they are actually doing on climate change. There's been a really significant move, I'd say, in the last 12 months, as opposed to, while this issue's been around for a while, the last 12 months has seen a significant acceleration of many of the world's largest financial institutions requiring the companies that they invest in and the fund managers that they give money to actually demonstrate how they're taking climate into account and what they're doing to reducing emissions. Shareholders are becoming far more activist in that sense. And you've seen the letters from the like of Larry Fink, who are calling on the firms they work with to actually also take significant action. So I think that sort of momentum around the world has been very significant. And in a number of countries now, this disclosure obligation is being legislated. If you just take New Zealand, for example, they've legislated into law the need for companies to disclose their action on climate. And they've also imposed jail terms for directors who do not put that into play. So the momentum around this sort of legislative process and this holding to account companies for climate risk is becoming a little bit akin to occupational health and safety risk. And so it's taken incredibly seriously. I think secondly, as we've seen earlier this year with the Biden summit in the US, there's been a number of countries, particularly the US and the UK, who have increased their commitments towards reducing emissions. And the US commitment to get to 50% reductions by 2030 is a significant shift of the global agenda. And even if the US were to get half the way there, the momentum that will build in the short term and then more so over the long term is incredibly significant. And it puts a lot of pressure on other governments, including, to be frank, my own government, Australia, to move a lot faster and harder going forward. And I think that discussion is interesting because you're also seeing now a lot of discussion around the imposition of trade barriers or the imposition of border tax adjustments on companies from countries who are not taking fast enough action on climate. And all of this stuff together, these sort of, whether it's soft commitments, policy commitments, international law commitments, or it's actually more stringent measures and more direct measures, are all driving momentum around action on climate. And then I think finally, the other really important point moving on from the Biden administration is that we are really seeing some significant statements and momentum shifts that are occurring. It was only earlier this week that the International Energy Agency, which has traditionally been a fairly conservative agency in terms of estimating the integration of renewables into power systems and the rate of that change, has actually announced that there is no more room for new oil and gas in the global economy if we are to reach the Paris Agreement goals and keep climate within safe limits. That is a significant quantum shift, and that does also influence where capital flows. So I think what we're at the moment, and from our own perspective, there has been a rapid acceleration of this focus on climate change and the need for significant change to occur, which has been occurring, but it has really accelerated in the last 6 to 12 months. And the Biden summit and now statements like the IEA are just going to continue to drive that. So where does this leave us in terms of what we need to do going ahead, and how does law tie into investment? From our perspective, there are 3 key things that will really ultimately deliver the outcome that the globe needs on climate change. The first is law and policy. The second is finance, and the third is technology. And those first 2 are very much about what this conference is about. So I just wanted to make a few comments and observations on those areas today. When we talk about law and policy, one of the interesting things is that climate change is, in many ways, it's a new area of law over the last 10 years, really. We've had areas of law like contracts, torts, you have international trade law, you have international environmental law that have all evolved over many, many years. But I think it was really only with the UNFCCC agreement, the Paris, and then the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement that a really substantive body of international climate change law emerged. And then what we've been seeing is a number of governments around the world, like the European Union, the UK, a number of countries like Australia, New Zealand, California, that have pieces of legislation that do oversee methods to reduce emissions within the economy, and also to really, in a way, incentivize actions that reduce emissions through offsets. And so what's been interesting is that development of legal frameworks to reduce emissions and to introduce emissions trading schemes, but also to go more broadly on climate change, sets an agenda for an economy to start to create investment opportunities. Secondly, that momentum around legislation is not just restricted to developed countries. We're also seeing countries now like Fiji have introduced a draft climate change law. Indonesia is working on a presidential decree on climate change, as well as a presidential decree and regulations on offset markets. Colombia have introduced an emissions trading scheme some time ago with offsets. So we're seeing a real momentum around the world of many countries that are introducing sorts of legislation that will help reduce emissions within the economy. Even more significantly, though, are some of the policy measures, which often turn into legislation that actually change entire industries. So in a number of jurisdictions, we've seen governments introduce laws or policies that say we will phase out all combustion vehicles by a particular date. So in Sweden, I think it's 2027. In other countries, it's 2030. The Brits have also got a legislative target there. And what that does is it sends a long-term signal to investors to say the intention is that we are going to phase this out over time. As investors get ready for the change that's happening, the older assets will sort of become stranded and we're moving into a new phase of new assets, but giving people time to make that adjustment. And so in that sense, people often ask, well, what is the role and why is law and policy important in climate change? It's important because it sets an agenda, it sets in a framework, it accelerates change, and it also removes investor uncertainty. In a country like Australia at the moment, where we have a huge amount of uncertainty around our policy frameworks in the energy sector, we have a government that has not yet committed formally to net zero by 2050. They're moving in that direction, but there is not a really aggressive plan. The investment community is moving a lot further and a lot faster than the government is, but it's also slowed down by the fact that, are we going to have encouragement from government to have a full transition to electric vehicles? When will that occur? And how fast will that occur? Without clear legal signals in the policy framework, there's an uncertainty as to how far you can go and how fast you can go. And the result, therefore, is that we get left behind as a market for electric vehicle manufacturers, and it tends to drip in much more slowly than happen much more quickly. And the focus then goes on to those economies that are far more sophisticated in their legislative programs. What's also important is that law and policy means that those countries that do adopt fairly robust regimes around climate change will set targets, and they will decrease emissions, and they will encourage investment to come into those jurisdictions in order to build new economies and in order to build the transition technologies that are required to occur. So often, many of you will have heard the term, the importance of law is that it must be long, loud and legal. So it must be long-term and clear. It must be very clear what it wants to do, and i.e. loud, and it must be legal in that it's in place and it's in force. So really good policy and law that is very clear, takes a long-term view in what is an incredibly dynamic space is fundamentally important to accelerate the climate change space. That then brings me on to the issue of finance. And there is a lot of debate about the important role of climate finance. There's been a huge amount of commitment globally towards driving finance into the climate change space to basically transform these economies. There's no shortage of people wishing to put money into the space. I think Blackstone have predicted that over the next 15 years, we'll need $100 trillion of climate finance to make major change. But one of the challenges that we find is twofold. So firstly, a lot of the investors who are making these commitments can't find things to invest in, and that is a real challenge. There's a lack of pipeline. And secondly, a lot of this finance just really waits for the investment to come. So they say, we're very happy to invest in a new technology that might enable you to build green steel, but they don't really want to invest in the development of that technology. So unlike sectors like perhaps healthcare and the medical field, where there's a huge amount of investment into R&D, into the decarbonisation space, there's much more limited investment into R&D. And a lot of the wall of capital that is focused on wanting to transition is really not investing in that underlying need. So again, there are very important law and policy mechanisms that governments can play here to facilitate that. So one is, for example, providing tax concessions into research into decarbonisation technologies. Another one is to provide guarantees that in the event someone comes up with a technology or somebody wants to build new transmission lines to move solar and wind around the country, that the government might underwrite those in the short term. Another really important one is government procurement policy. So where a government talks about the need to say we want to switch entirely to electric buses, for example, And in my state, in New South Wales and Australia, the government said we want to introduce 8,000 electric buses. Off the back of that, you can build an electric bus industry through government contracting. And of course, that is something that in the US, in many sectors, you have seen government play a key role in building whole economic systems through government contracting. And so I think, the role that government can play and the role that law and policy can play in that shifting of finance is also critically important. I think also, I would say the other key thing for the finance community, and I was presenting earlier this week at a conference in Australia for the superannuation, which is our investment sector, is that there's also this need to make sure that investors build climate risk into the investment decisions they make. So increasingly, we're seeing investors say that we don't want to finance assets that will become stranded over the long term. So, for example, we're getting out of coal. We believe that gas, is increasingly becoming more expensive as other forms of energy become cheaper. And so gas has a limited sort of, lifespan. And that's, and therefore, for how long do we as an investor make sure that we limit our investment in the gas sector? And then again, that decision about getting out of coal or restricting your investment in gas has only now been accelerated by the IEA's own statement this week to get out of. We should not be investing in any new coal or oil or gas. And therefore, those decisions have to be made. The question then becomes, as you exit from those assets to avoid being stranded, again, it comes back to my earlier point, is what do you invest in? And creating those investment opportunities is absolutely critical. The other issue here, which then comes into this play, is there are two issues here. One is, what is the ability to borrow money for new investments? And in the older economy, the ability to borrow borrow money for gas or those sorts of old fossil fuels is becoming much more difficult. In the short term, it's harder to get, it's more expensive, and in the longer term, it simply will not be available. So when we're developing a project as an investor and you're looking at the particular economic modelling around that investment, you need to build in what we are now calling a climate risk adjusted cost of capital. So how is it that you adjust the cost of that capital to take into account climate risk? And then the final comment I really want to just touch on is moving along from law and moving along from finance. One of the real challenges, I guess, in the climate change space is how do we then shift all of this to finance areas that are traditionally not been ones that generate a direct traditional financial rate of return. So over the last sort of 6 months, there's been a tremendous amount of dialogue around the importance of funding nature and preserving global biodiversity. As many of you may have seen, Prince Charles has launched his Terra Carta, which is all about the need for finance to fund nature. Many of our global banking institutions have launched quite large discussion papers about the importance of funding nature and biodiversity. But on its own, funding nature does not provide a traditional economic return. So one of the ventures that we at Pollination established at the start of the COVID period was a joint venture with HSBC Asset Management out of London to really look at setting up a natural capital investment vehicle which is targeted at investing in nature and trying to create an entirely new asset class, which is nature, that people and institutional investors can invest in. We're only at the start of that process, and we start off by basically targeting two areas. One is natural capital, so investing in sustainable forestry, regenerative agriculture, sustainable fisheries, and trying to make sure that those business enterprises that rely on nature do so in a more sustainable manner that in fact enhances the natural capital value as opposed to detracts from it. And then the second area we're focused on is carbon. How do you finance very large rainforest, reef systems, peatlands, mangroves, and actually generate carbon reductions from those that can then be sold and finance the reinvestment in those nature platforms? While carbon is one proxy to do that, we need to be able to move the law and policy framework and the finance framework so that eventually institutional investors and other investors will also put a value on the biodiversity in those investments, as well as the watershed values and other values. So a key part of this sort of global shift at the moment is to not only look at how does law and policy help, but also how does finance shift itself into those areas that perhaps are critical to climate change, but do not provide a traditional economic return. And another one that is a challenging area is also adaptation. And you'll hear later on today, I think, some commentary around the importance of financing adaptation. So I think those are just some reflections I'd like to make. I think as lawyers, we play a really important role in the global climate change debate. We play a very important role in the transition. Good law and policy will drive change and accelerate change. And to advocate for good law and policy is really important. And that will then help investors get clear signals, and it will help set agendas for the large amount of capital that's been allocated to climate change to flow. So I hope those are just some helpful introductory comments. I really wish the conference goes very well, and I really would like to thank you for asking me to talk today. Thanks very much.
And one of the things you mentioned, which I think we're also aware of, is how rapidly things have been changing in the last 6 to 12 months. Is there anything that you have a concern about when things are moving so fast, in terms of what worries you? What do we really need to make sure we get right in this short term?
That's a really good question. I think that one of the key issues when things are moving very fast and governments don't play an active role is that people will be left behind, and the transition will occur, and there'll be people who are basically might be working on in a particular industry that basically becomes stranded. So I think one of the lessons is to have very articulate, well-planned policies and well-planned measures that look ahead into the distance, beyond the 3 or 4 year election cycle, that actually think, what is our plan for the global economy? What is our plan for our national economy longer term? It's also the case that we just will not get some stuff right. And, you know, an example of this is, it's interesting that Australia probably has the most dynamic and the most challenging energy market in the world. You have an energy market that was traditionally all about large power stations around the country, coal, gas, that use transition lines to feed energy into the cities. This has been completely disrupted with the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world, which is now being combined with batteries. And one of the things early on was the system became highly unstable. And so there's been a massive rush to include batteries and pumped hydro to stabilise the system. And we're well on the way there. And we're now coming out the other end. But, you know, there will be casualties in that disruption, and so good planning and good policy. The other thing that I've also noticed, which is really particularly interesting, is that quite often you have very good technologies and very new ways of doing things, but the law and policy and the regulation cannot keep up. So there may often be a very silly regulation that prevents something happening because it's about how the old system worked, not how the new system works, and therefore it doesn't actually adjust. And therefore you get roadblocks in the ability to rapidly transform.
Another question I have is, at the beginning of your talk, you discussed your career path and how you are now working in a more interdisciplinary context with scientists and people in finance and technology. Can you discuss a little bit more about how you have incorporated scientists specifically into your work as an attorney?
The critical thing about law, and for many years I was a professor at Australian National University teaching, in our first lecture, we would always have a scientist come and present the landscape of climate science, what was going on, because you need to understand the risks, you need to understand what is happening from a physical point of view and what you're preparing for. So when we're advising clients on climate risk or how climate will affect their investments or their assets, understanding that the science behind that and the rate of change is very, very important. And I guess quite often what we find particularly interesting is that people will say to us, that'll never happen, that isn't happening, that's not possible. And when you're able to produce a scientist who has the data, you'll be able to produce an example of a technology in play, you can say, well, actually, it is already happening. And so it gives a lot more weight to being able to assess things like climate and transition risk, which I think is particularly important. The other thing I'd say, which is one thing which is particularly interesting that we've found, is that the area of finance that has rapidly started to take these sort of issues up is in fact private equity. So we've found that in the private equity space, private equity investors who have bought assets, they want to hold them for 4 or 5 years and then flip them, are much more mindful of the fact that climate is moving quite quickly. And when they bought the asset, they did not think of climate risk. Now, the asset, and everybody's asking them, what is the climate risk on that asset? So again, on one of the projects we worked on recently, which was a suite of dairy farms, the scientists were looking very closely at what is the likely forward trajectory of the climate change scenarios in those areas where those dairy farms are, and do they have a long-term viable future, or is the climate such that they really need to move dairy farming to other areas?
Martine, you also mentioned biodiversity, which is such an integral part of our society and how our economy ultimately does function, the impacts of that. And you talked about your project with HSBC, which sounds very cutting edge and is wonderful. How else can we as a society in our economy put a value on biodiversity? It seems like now everything is derivative, right? We look at carbon as the proxy, as you mentioned. But for example, the rainforest has, when there's biodiversity in the rainforest, for example, it also leads to ultimately it helps with health and so many other things, medicine. How else could we possibly, what is the innovative way that might be out there for us to actually put a value on biodiversity?
So from my perspective, you do see in a number of countries and governments around the world that do have biodiversity offset programs at the moment. So, where someone is doing some sort of activity that may affect biodiversity, then you have to offset that with a different piece of biodiversity. While those programs are okay, I mean, at the end of the day, destroying one beautiful piece of biodiversity and trying to replace it elsewhere, to me, doesn't really add up, I guess. There's another interesting program in Australia where the Queensland government has a fund called the Land Restoration Fund, where they pay you for carbon credits, but they also pay you for the additional values those carbon credits produce. So whether it's a watershed value, or whether it's a koala habitat value, or some other value that brings. So you're actually seeing stacking of different environmental co-benefits on top of the carbon credit. And at the end of the day, the fact is the government would either have to pay for the restoration of those watershed areas or those habitats, or it can combine multiple streams by the private sector undertaking those activities and funding them. Look, these are all really good measures, but they're really around the edges. In my view, we need a much more holistic approach to nature and to biodiversity. And one of the things that we've been working on and looking at is how do you build really a global, reserve of nature. So in the same way that corporates are required to set aside, in the same way that financial institutions are required to set aside capital for the under the Basel rules, in the same way that governments must set aside strategic oil reserves under certain rules, we think there should be a call for governments and corporates to set aside what is a natural capital reserve and build that up. And I'm working on a paper on this at the moment, but I think it's a really important thing that we need to do. And so to value nature as, without healthy nature, we will not have a healthy economy. And biodiversity is absolutely critical to that. And I think it needs to also be seen as a public good. Remember that much of the world's biodiversity is also located in, a lot of it's in developing country, owned by Indigenous peoples. It's not something that we should be monetizing by pharmaceutical companies and others, but we should be seeing that this plays a critical role. I mean, the reality is if we lose the Amazon, we really lose US agriculture. So I think, having a perspective and a global perspective on this is absolutely critical, and bringing this to the fore is also really, really important.
So you discussed corporate disclosures and standards. Can we get there? How do you foresee the standards working? Can we have a truly comparable set around the world? Will we have a race to the bottom? What is the kind of key factor that's going to make this work, in your view?
That you're absolutely right. There are many different disclosures, and we've been through a transition of having the Carbon Disclosure Project, and then governments developing different and then the Investor Group on Climate Change having disclosure rules. And I think what happened was, among many companies that we've spoken to, there was a bit of fatigue on disclosure. And I think there were so many people asking for different disclosure that really, in many ways, the TCFD has now become the default global standard. To me, what's really important about disclosure is that governments legislate disclosure as a requirement, and they're very clear about how you go about doing that. I also think people should not use as an excuse the need to tell people how to disclose before the legislation comes in. So I think in the case of New Zealand, and I think the France and UK are going this direction, legislating disclosure and at the same time articulating what that requires is really important. And I think that will make a major difference. There's no doubt that the pressure from financial institutions and insurance companies and the need to disclose has driven a lot of change because it's created significant awareness, but it needs to go further. The New Zealand case of introducing a jail term for directors that don't take climate into account properly and disclose properly, and you have to meet a fairly high bar there to go to jail, but it does turn a director's mind to the fact that this issue is as serious as, for example, occupational health and safety and people's welfare. So I think it has a very important role to play, but it's just one of the policy tools that we need. Obviously, introducing caps on emitters is also critically important. And I also think that finally, I'll just say for those companies that are disclosing, we shouldn't say that disclosing is sufficient. Many of the world's largest corporates are still very much in the old economy and are not shifting out to the new economy, and that's a challenge, right? So there are certain parts of the economy that are absolutely critical. Steel is critical, but we should be focused on green steel and other things like that. But we need to make sure that disclosure is the start of the journey, and then companies are held to account for how are they actually going to take action to reduce emissions and how are they going to implement that. And there is now a movement on companies to do that. Unilever is the first global company to actually set out a plan as to how they'll do that, but that's the trajectory that we should be on.
And yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much.